delighted to have one of the three winning teams from the Diamond Dollars case competition yesterday morning present the case that they presented to the judges that in fact earned them the win in the case comp. Before I introduce them, I'm going to just give everyone here in the room just a very quick overview of what the case was, so perhaps you'll have a better sense of the work that's going to be presented by the Ohio University team. The case this year was, I asked teams, the student teams, to build a bullpen. So I asked them to construct a bullpen with a certain set of constraints and pick any team they wanted to in the National League and have that bullpen be the bullpen that replaces that National League team's bullpen. And the constraints I gave them were that I took out Aroldis Chapman and Wade Davis and made them ineligible, not because of Aroldis Chapman's suspension, but just because I didn't want to have everybody gravitating to those two. I wanted to get different solutions by different creative student teams around the problem. So I gave them a list of 4 relievers, and they had to pick one from that list. I gave them a list of another 4 relievers, and they'll share with you the details. And I had them pick one from that list, and I gave them a list of 12 relievers, had them pick 2 from that list. And then finally, they could choose their 5th reliever as an at-large bullpen arm. And really the essence of this case was to see how the students processed and evaluated relief pitchers. We know that we deal with a small sample size when we have relief pitchers. Think about it this way: a relief pitcher in a given season typically faces about 1/3 as many batters as a starter does over the course of a season. So it'd be like evaluating a starter on 2 months worth of data, really, when you think about it in terms of batters faced. The other thing I wanted them to do is I wanted to add the dimension of sort of considering a portfolio effect or a fit across the bullpen to make sure that the arms could play complementary roles, to make sure that they fit from whatever definition they used to define fit. So I think I've given you enough background just so you get a sense of the case. And with that, I'm very proud to announce or welcome and hand the mic over to Sam Smith, the captain of the Ohio University team.
Hey guys, thank you so much for coming out. We have the distinction of being the act that follows the Stanford Sports Analytics Club. First off, we're honored to be here. We'd like to thank the judges for giving us this opportunity. We watched a lot of presentations yesterday and we were very impressed, so it's a huge honor to be up here in front of everyone. As Mr. Gennaro mentioned, we are the Ohio University team. My name's Sam Smith with Brian Baker, Harris Kasserman, and Nick Crawford. And we're going to walk you through our process for building the optimal Pittsburgh Pirates 2016 bullpen. First off, we'll discuss how we happened upon the Pittsburgh Pirates as our National League team of choice. Next, we'll give a brief overview of our pitcher selections. We'll walk you through the general methodology that we approached this case with. We'll give an in-depth description of each metric that we use to measure pitcher performance. We'll give a breakdown of each pitcher. We'll give an overview of our portfolio as a whole, and then we'll wrap up with some time left over for Q&A. First, Nick will walk you through why we selected the Pittsburgh Pirates.
Thank you, Sam. For our team selection process, the first thing we did was consider all NL teams projected to be over 500 in the coming MLB season. The reason we did this is we thought a good bullpen wouldn't necessarily impact a sub-500 team the way it would a team that would be over 500. A good bullpen could push a team into the playoffs, possibly grant them a World Series berth. Next, we calculated expected score differential at the time of the starting pitcher's exit for the coming 2016 MLB season. Then we found that the lowest run score differential was the Pittsburgh Pirates with a .31. This means that they'd have a lot of high leverage situations and have to play in a lot of close games, which is optimal for a very good bullpen. In context, the Chicago Cubs had a run score differential of roughly 1. Now on to our selections. For Tier A, we had Dellin Betances. Tier B, we had Zach Britton. Our 2 Tier C selections were Carson Smith and Fernando Familia, and our at-large selection was Will Smith. Now on to Harris with our general methodology.
Thank you, Nick. I'm now going to walk you through our general methodology that we use for this case study. And when we first got this case study, we felt it was very important to consider 3 specific categories in particular. and those categories were performance, risk, and portfolio. So the first and most important category that we considered was actually performance, and the first two statistics or metrics that we used when we were considering performance were two statistics that we actually created, and those were fielding-dependent pitching, or FDP, and pitch value. And we used these two specific metrics in particular so we could actually evaluate the specific set of criteria that we deemed to be very important in this given case study. The third performance metric that we used was WPA, or win probability added. Once we considered each pitcher in the player pool's performance metrics, the next thing we did was we took them through our given risk metrics, and those risk metrics that we used were WPA variance as well as injury risk. Once we considered each pitcher's performance as well as their risk, the next thing we did was we took them through our portfolio fit to see how they would fare against the righties and lefties that the Pirates projected to face in the 2016 season. Overall, we worked from the top down, first considering performance, then considering risk, and finally considering how they would fit together as a group. The first performance metric that we actually considered in this case was fielding-dependent pitching, or FDP, and while that may seem like a pretty simple formula, it's actually pretty comprehensive. We wanted to take the 2015 XFIP formula and actually adjust the variables within the formula so that we could use it to project 2016 ERA. And how we did that was, first, instead of using the XFIP formula for all pitchers, we actually adjusted it to reflect for relievers only. After that, we took the league average home run for fly ball rate that's in this formula, and we changed it to reflect for the Pirates schedule and the weighted average home run for fly ball rate of all the parks that the Pirates project to play in the 2016 season. The third thing we did was we changed the FIP constant in the formula to adjust for league ERA. So we changed league ERA to switch each pitcher's 2015 defense to the defense that they are projected to have with the 2016 Pirates. Overall, this formula accounted for the 2016 Pirates schedule and their projected defense, and was able to give us a formula that we could use to project each pitcher's 2016 ERA. Now to talk about the FTP raw results, I'm going to pass it over to Brian.
Thank you, Harris. So what we found when we ran these results were numbers that are scaled just like ERA. So when you look at a pitcher like, for instance, Carson Smith with a 2.38 FDP, you can treat that the same way that you would view a pitcher with a 2.38 ERA. So FDP and ERA are on the same sort of scale. But we wanted to make this metric easier to follow and easier to understand, so we converted it into wins. So in order to do that, what we did is we took the FTP raw results and we divided them by 9. And so what this shows is how many runs each pitcher is giving up per inning. Then we multiplied it by their 65 projected innings. We chose 65 because we felt if our bullpen was performing at its optimal level, each pitcher should pitch on average 65 innings. So what we did from there is we divided the number of runs by 9.8 to sort of show how many wins each pitcher was going to give up, and then we scaled it so that it was compared to an average pitcher. So for instance, as you can see on the screen, sticking with Carson Smith, we projected him to have 0.88 wins. This doesn't mean that he's going to contribute 0.88 wins on his own. It just means that when compared to an average pitcher, who in this case was Dan Jennings of the Chicago White Sox, we project that Carson Smith, over his 65 projected innings, will contribute 0.88 more wins to his team than Dan Jennings would have. So once we'd created this performance metric, we moved on to our next performance metric, which is pitch value. And so Sam will take you through how we came up with pitch value.
Thanks, Brian. So pitch value was something that we thought was pretty original. What we did was we looked at each pitcher and we looked at each pitch they threw. For each pitch, we looked at 3 things: the run saved per 100 times they threw that pitch, the frequency that they threw the pitch, and the Z-score of the Pirates' 2016 schedule's effectiveness against that pitch compared to league average. We multiplied these 3 metrics together and added up each pitcher's score for each pitch in order to get a pitch value metric for every player in our pool. It's worth noting with this metric that a lower number is better because it's reflective of our opponent's ability to hit against a given pitcher. And it's also worth noting that this metric takes both the schedule of batters that the Pirates will face in 2016 and the repertoire of each pitcher into account, which our other two metrics do not. It's a little bit small up there, but at the bottom of the screen, you'll see the Z-score of the Pirates' 2016 schedule's ability to hit each pitch relative to league average. So, for example, the Pirates' schedule is 0.4 of a standard deviation worse against a slider than league average. That means we were going to favor guys that could throw sliders versus guys that relied on curveballs because our schedule was 0.14 standard deviations above average against a curveball. On the left side of the screen, you'll see the frequency that each pitcher threw each pitch, and on the right side, you'll see the runs saved per 100 throws of each pitch. Now for our next metric, win probability added, I'll pass it back to Brian.
Thank you, Sam. So what we did with win probability added was we took sort of a new spin on an old statistic. So what we did is we took the weighted trailing 5-year average of each pitcher's change in WPA per appearance. So there are a couple of caveats with using this 5-year average. The first is that if a pitcher had not been in the league for 5 years, we only accounted for the years that they'd been in the league. So for instance, a pitcher like Ken Giles, who had only been in the league for 2 years, we adjusted the weighted trailing average to only take into account those 2 years. In addition, if a pitcher began as a starter and then became a reliever, we only took into account the time that they were a reliever because the goal of this statistic is to see pitchers that performed well in high leverage situations. So for us, we didn't think it made a lot of sense to have a starter and penalize them for starting the game and not having as many high leverage situations. So what we did once we'd come up with this average was we multiplied the figure we had by the 65 projected innings. And the goal of this was to find wins added in these high leverage situations. So the results we found kind of reflect things we found earlier. Dylan Betances and Zach Britton, who are two pitchers that you've heard a lot about already, finished 1 and 2 in this metric. Carson Smith, who was a Tier C pitcher, finished in the top of Tier C. And Fernando Familia, a pitcher we did end up selecting, was a little bit farther down the list. Harris will explain how we ended up putting all of these metrics together and why we still ended up selecting Familia despite his relative lack of strength in this particular metric.
So now that we evaluated each of these performance metrics and how each pitcher performed in each of these metrics, the next thing we had to do was figure out a way to combine these metrics in order to evaluate our players as a whole. So how we did that was we took the Z-score of all 3 metrics for each potential pitcher. We then found the average Z-score per metric in order to find the best performers in each tier. And here are those results. So you can see that we took the pitcher with the highest average Z-score in each tier. So for Tier A, our selection was Dylan Betances because his average Z-score of 1.154 was higher than the other pitchers in his tier, Andrew Miller, Kenley Jansen, and Craig Kimbrell. Our Tier B selection was Zach Britton, and again, that was because he had a higher average Z-score than actually anyone in this data set. So he was a pretty obvious selection for Tier B. Our Tier C selections, Carson Smith and Fernando Familia, had higher average Z-scores than anyone else in their tier again, making them easy selections for our portfolio. Now I'm going to pass it over to Nick to talk about our risk assessment.
Thank you, Harris. For our risk assessment, we looked at 2 main factors, performance risk and injury risk. For performance risk, we took a weighted 5-year trailing average of WPA variance per appearance. In this context, the lower the variance, the more consistent a reliever would be. Then we treated injury as a binary variable, and if any of our selections had any cause for concerns with injury, we would take another look at them. If there was still a cause for concern after that other look, we would disqualify them. If there was no cause for concern for any of our selections, we would keep them in our list. Next, onto the WPA variations. As you can see, 3 of the players for our WPA variations placed well below the average of 0.0228. The only problem with this list is Zach Britton placing above the average with a 0.0315 variation. This was definitely a cause for concern, but we'll dive into that a little later as to why he was still on our list of selections. Next, on to Harris with our portfolio fit.
Thank you, Nick. So once we considered performance and risk metrics, the next category that we felt it was important to consider was portfolio fit, or how all these players would fit together. So what we did was we took each pitcher's average against right-handed batters and divided it by each pitcher's average against left-handed batters to evaluate how they would fare against the hitters the Pirates were projected to face in 2016. Overall, an average slightly below 1 would be optimal because the Pirates project to face more righties than lefties in the 2016 season. So going through each player, Dellin Betances had a portfolio fit slightly above 1, which means he neutralized lefties and righties at a nearly identical clip. Zach Britton, being a left-handed pitcher, had a portfolio fit slightly above 1, meaning he was slightly better against lefties than righties. So with our next two selections, we were lucky to have people that would balance us out back to being better against righties than lefties, given that Carson Smith and Fernando Familia fared better against righties than they did against lefties. So now that we've evaluated performance as well as risk, as well as portfolio fit, we're now going to walk through our results individually. So again, our Tier A selection was Dellin Betances. His average Z-score of 1.154 scored higher than any other player in his tier. He also had very low risk. His risk fell below our average risk threshold of 0.228. His portfolio fit, again, neutralized righties and lefties at a nearly identical clip, made him an easy selection for our Tier A selection.
For our Tier B selection, we selected Zach Britton. He was easily the leader in wins by FTP, as well as his pitch value score, and he finished second in wins by WPA, which gave him easily the highest Z-score. We liked Zach Britton quite a bit, as we talked about earlier. We liked him so much we would have selected him had he been a Tier A pitcher. And a sort of humorous anecdote, when we originally created the wins by FTP statistic, we originally created it so that it was named Wins Not Britain. And so how it worked was a pitcher was assigned to score a negative value basically by how many wins they would cost their team by not pitching as well as Zach Britton. But we decided that it was a little bit easier to follow if we scaled it against an average pitcher instead of with Zach Britton as the baseline. Now, if our favorite pitcher on this list had one weakness, it would have been his risk factor. As we talked about earlier, it was a little bit higher than the average. But what we did is we really went in and we looked at the numbers, and what was really driving up his variance was two outings where he'd basically taken what would have been a sure win for the Orioles and ended up losing the game. And so what we did is we pulled those two numbers out of the data set just to see what would happen, and his risk dropped to 0.020, which was well below the average and a number we would have felt particularly comfortable with. And so since we like Zach Britton so much in the other metrics, we decided to stick with him. His portfolio fit, as he's a left-handed pitcher, skews him more towards being dominant against left-handed batters. So it was a good thing that our Tier C candidates helped to balance all of that out. So overall, we were very, very happy with Zach Britton as our Tier B selection.
Our first Tier C selection was newly minted Red Sox Carson Smith. He scored very well across all three performance metrics, giving him an average Z-score of .799. This was, by a pretty wide margin, the best Z-score in Tier C. His risk metric of .0161 didn't raise any eyebrows, and his portfolio fit of .8 was a nice compliment to Betances and Britton, both of whom are better against left-handers than right-handers. All things considered, we felt very good about Carson Smith as our first Tier C selection.
Our second Tier C selection was one Fernando Familia. He performed fairly well in three of our performance metrics, notably his pitch value score. The reason it's notable is because he was the only player on the list of 20 candidates that threw a split-finger fastball. His average Z-score kind of seems a little bit alarming, but as Harris mentioned, he was the second highest scoring Tier C candidate. Now onto his risk, he scores well below the average of .0228, and his portfolio fit also may seem a little bit alarming since he's way more dominant against righties than lefties, but our at-large selections help balance the overall portfolio.
So our methodology for our at-large selection process was actually quite similar to the process that we used to select our tier performers. And what we did was we incorporated the 3 performance metrics that we used for the data set, except we applied it to all eligible pitchers. And in this case study, an eligible pitcher was defined as a reliever who threw at least 50 relief innings pitched in 2015. So once we did that, we found the pitcher with the highest average Z-score that also met our risk and portfolio requirements. And that selection was Will Smith. His average Z-score came out to be .7475, which would have put him amongst the top of our Tier C selections. Again, his risk fell well below our risk threshold, and his portfolio fit actually skewed us right back to where we wanted to be, giving us a total portfolio fit of about .9434, or about 6% better against righties than we were against lefties. And that was a number we calculated to be an ideal number. Now to conclude our presentation, I'm going to pass it back to Sam.
Thanks, Harris. So we took all the factors that you can see on the board here into account, and given our 5-day window, we believe that we have come up with a pretty comprehensive analysis of the case and built an optimal Pittsburgh Pirates bullpen for the 2016 season. We thank you guys for listening. We hope you enjoyed the presentation, and we'd like to open it up for question and answer. Yes?
Yeah, there were actually a couple candidates that had pretty similar Z-scores. Brett Cecil comes to mind, but overall his portfolio or his pitches, he mainly had a curveball, and his curveball was his best pitch, and our opponents projected to fare the best against curveballs rather than any other pitch that Will Smith threw, who actually favors sliders. So.
We had considered it. What we had in mind specifically was running some sort of regression. What we had considered was running some sort of regression on the 2014 numbers to see how they had affected 2015 WAR, basically projecting forward and seeing which ones had the greatest weight. But at the end of the day, we were kind of running short on time at the end, and we figured that with an equal weight, we weren't going to be skewed towards any of them unfairly. We thought that WPA was important because we wanted guys that could perform well in high leverage situations. So obviously the other two context neutral, but at the end of the day, we wanted to fill our bullpen with as many guys as possible that had solid track records when it counted most. So for WPA, we deliberately sort of took context into account to see how they performed when it mattered most.
No, we didn't really, but it's something that we definitely could look at in the future.
So as we talked about, the performance metrics were really the first thing we looked at, and so I mean, and my team could disagree because fortunately that didn't come up. But I think how we felt is if it really depended, since the performance metrics were the most important to us. If we felt we had an at-large selection whose performance, we definitely accounted for the performance a lot more than the portfolio fit. So if definitely the performance outweighed the portfolio fit, we would have stuck with the performance and lived with having a bit of a skewed portfolio fit.
For that, it was mainly up to manager discretion to see which guy was utilized in whatever way they see fit. Zach Britton is obviously a closer, but it's honestly just dependent on how the manager would want to place all of our guys. So.
And going off that just a bit, we felt pretty confident that, considering WPA, any pitcher could perform in a high leverage situation. So as Nick touched on, it was mostly manager discretion, but we feel confident that we would have built a pretty versatile bullpen. We didn't necessarily tab one guy, the designated closer, the designated long man, or what have you, but we felt pretty good that all 5 guys could perform in any situation. All right, thank you guys very much. Really appreciate it.